So Peter Racy here again in the final in this particular series. I can see that there will be storylines come out of it. Saving the Dalgety flyer is the first one that springs to mind, and we're just going to do a little bit of a tidy up and a wind up to make a complete package. So let's move on. So Peter Racy back again. Now we've started out with the end in mind, and how there was a funding stream that was to be put in place, which didn't actually eventuate. And we've talked in and around, Andrew, your effectively your life. So let's go right back to the core starting of all this. You were born, I understand, in Hughenden.
Yes.
What did your parents do?
We were on a sheep property just outside Hughenden on what's called the jump up. So the jump up is the division between all the rivers that run to the Gulf and the rivers that run to Lake Eyre.
Well, I mean, Sir Frank Moore would be very interested in knowing that, because obviously his new Bradfield scheme is right situated at that jump up to refunnel water back and across using new technology. Yeah, it was very good. And so you got to know John Underwood in Hughenden, or you knew of him after you got down to Brisbane?
No, we knew of the Underwoods before we got to Brisbane, went to boarding school together. So he was a bit older than I, but one of his legacies was this amazing portrait of Joan Baez on the Master's Common Room pull-down screen. So he was a bit of a larrikin, and he used to surprise the teachers and the authorities with his provocative artwork.
That's a good story. I'm hoping to actually go up to Phuket, where he is, and do a face-to-face interview after the travel restrictions are lifted and budgetary considerations can be handled, and family matters put in order. Okay, so you've gone to boarding school down here, obviously not TSS, you're too well cultured for that, and you're decided then to do architecture, which obviously there must be a line, I'm not quite seeing it, between being on a sheep farm and architecture, but so you can tell us a bit about that linkage. And you're decided then to do architecture, which obviously there must be a line, I'm not quite seeing it, between being on a sheep farm and architecture, but so you can tell us a bit about that linkage.
Well, I always, as a young kid, formed an impression about people who ran properties from the layout of the homestead. So it was, I suppose, a personal interest of mine as a young kid. I had no idea it related to architecture, but I used to form an opinion about the way in which people organised themselves. I'm not being critical, I'm just saying how they organised their operation on a day-to-day basis, and I would pick up and get to know those souls in terms of the way in which everything was managed. So I became very, I suppose, reflective of the country. I believe that I had an enormous connection to country. Like I can, we left our rural properties when I was about 12, but those roads, the trees, the landscape is indelibly imprinted in my head, my psyche. And so when I went out of school into architecture, I used to be the only person in our year to argue the case for an Australian architecture. Everyone else wanted to talk about Northern Europe and the Japanese influences and the German influences, but somehow I believe I failed to convince anyone to say we have a strong character of our national identity in the 7/8 of the country. And so I used to write about the way in which we would develop our image, our brand, how we would promote rural Australia.
So on that point, and I don't particularly want to intrude and stop your thoughts, but I think it's of relevance. So James McCormack, his linkage was, I think it was 63 Expo, where he designed that breathtakingly simple but complex hanging roof structure, which was very avant-garde, very unique, and is only last year, believe it or not, demolished and lost to the people of the world, which was a great shame. Didn't even rate a mention in Australia that something that was really of great Australian heritage was being demolished in Japan. So did you come across James's flair for architectural, Australian architectural statement?
Well, I always had a very different approach to architecture. I studied in detail the way successful architects were marketing their services. I never ever said these architects are great at delivering the technical solution. I always wanted to know how they won the day in terms of getting the job. And so Robin Gibson was a great mentor to me. He had no knowledge that I was studying the way in which he operated.
Of cultural centre fame.
Cultural centre and a whole stack of other work that he did. He had a very unique way of approaching the market. And so I learnt very early in the piece that there was the marketing architect, the detailing design architect, and the technical building architect. So to make a good architectural practice you need three people, three different skills. And so when I started out, I worked for Goodser Baker Wild, and they had a guy called Bruce Goodser, and he was out there in the bush. He was setting up farms, and I learnt a little bit about his esoteric approach to architecture. And then I fell in love with people like Bruce Goff and writers like William Blake. So I was teetering on the edge of surrealism. So I would say we have an Australian character and it's surreal. So some of the architectural influences that I developed was, say, right, we have a shearing shed. How can that shearing shed become part of our national identity? We have outbuildings, homesteads. Do we need to make the homestead look like a version of something in Europe? Quickly I decided, no, we don't. So I was always looking for, let's say, the unique character. I had a great argument with my dad about the way in which trees formed boughs. And I painted this painting with these giant blobs coming out from the trees, and he said, "You never see trees like that, that's crazy." And
He obviously hasn't seen a tea tree.
Give him his dues. He came in one day and he said, "Well, you're right. I found this tree which looked exactly like the tree you've made up in your mind." And so from there I kept on trying to develop the symbols of Australian architecture, or symbols of Australian built environment.
And so where does Silo in the City sit in this narrative? Because we've heard that it was an engineered, the design of it was effectively an engineered solution. But prior to that, obviously, being a silo, you got that idea from
the rural landscape. Absolutely. So we briefed the engineers. We developed what it had to be, and we won the day with Sir Lou Edwards. He was convinced that our concept was worth fighting for. He backed us, and he said, "We need something like that on the expo site." So we put together all the elements that we believed would indicate life in primary production, the battle of winning the product, winning the battle to get your product ready to go to market. And the big problem Australia faced at that time was that the same people who were growers weren't involved with marketing. So you had the big wigs from the various marketing boards, and every product had a marketing board.
Fat cats, yep.
And they had no real, and I say this with due respect, they had no real empathy with how much the actual dairy farmer got out of their products, how much the wool grower got out of their product, how much the cattle producers, how much the grain growers got out of their products. They were just selling it to the world market. And so I see that as the reason why we wanted to test the market and see if we could get all facets of rural production into a Brisbane exhibit. Now, it could have been the bicentennial year of activities, or it could have been Expo 88, and unfortunately we won enough battles to get the site of Expo 88, and as they say, the rest is history.
And it is great history, and people will see attached to this particular YouTube another treasure trove of photos that you unearthed yesterday.
Yes.
And really this has been such a pleasurable journey exploring the silo in the city. And Andrew, just really sincerely thank you for your time. Again, thank you to Jason Ford for his efforts in digitalisation, and to Nick Ferris for his support and moral encouragement in the process. And with that, we'll say good afternoon and thank you indeed.
Thank you, Peter. It's been great, and Jason and Nick.